Please welcome to the stage Stephen T. Mnuchin, 77th Secretary of the Treasury for the United States of America, for a conversation with Bloomberg's ErikSchatzker.
Your Highness, Prime Minister, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Mr. Secretary, would you like to say anything?
Thank you. It's great to be back in Doha. Your Highness the Emir, it's always a pleasure to be here with you. I'd also like to thank the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and the various ministers of finance, commerce, and trade, world leaders, and excellencies. And most important, my good friend Gianni, the president of FIFA, another one of the most popular people in the room. We are all so excited and can't wait for World Cup at Qatar.
Mr. Secretary, policymakers around the world face the most challenging set of economic circumstances in decades. You, as Treasury Secretary, engineered some creative solutions, I might say, to stave off a full-blown depression back in early 2020. So I'd like you to put on your thinking cap once again and tell me, what is it that this Treasury Department and this presidential administration in the United States can do to rein in rampant inflation?
Well, let me just say, there are similarities and there are differences. I think at the time, COVID was just a very frightening situation, both from a humane situation, but more importantly, economically. We never anticipated shutting down the economy. For the last year, I've been worried about inflation in the U.S. I think in hindsight, we spent too much money and too much fiscal response. But I am confident that the Federal Reserve is now taking this very seriously. And I think that inflation will come back under control over the next 2 years, with one caveat. And just as several years ago, COVID was the big unknown, the war in Ukraine is now the big unknown. So obviously, it's a terrible situation on a lot of levels. But I think from an economic standpoint, we need to figure out how to get a stop to the war. And even if it's just a temporary, what we call frozen conflict, energy prices, the demand on energy, that is my biggest concern at the moment.
I am dying to ask you about the Federal Reserve and, of course, about the war in Ukraine as well. But let me for a moment stick with the range of options that policymakers have. We know the Biden administration is working on a range of measures, and other governments around the world are thinking about similar things. They're talking about a gas tax holiday. They're talking about capping the cost of insulin to help Medicare. They're talking about investing in decarbonization and also in fossil fuel production. From your point of view, what of those things, or perhaps other things, might actually work?
Well, I think there's not a lot of tools that the administration has at this point from an economic standpoint. When we were in COVID and we went to Congress, we got authorization for a lot of economic tools. So there's things you can do to spur the economy. When you're talking about inflation, quite frankly, this is really the Federal Reserve's job. And I do have a lot of confidence in Chair Powell. By the way, it's fun I can now talk about the Fed. I wasn't allowed to talk about Fed policy for many years. I guess my most important advice to the administration is don't do anything to shock the economy. So they had been talking about raising taxes. They had been talking about making different changes. Now is not the time to put any additional shocks. Things like gas tax on the margin may help a little bit, but this is really now the Federal Reserve's job, and the administration needs to be careful not to get in the way. I do think, the number one thing the administration can do, and I think it's not just them, it's obviously other world leaders, is we need to find a political solution to this war. The military solution alone is not going to be what stops this.
You have confidence in Chairman Powell, whom you know well, having worked together with him and other members of the Federal Reserve. The reality, however, is that financial markets aren't certain whether they have confidence in Chairman Powell. There's a growing consensus that the Federal Reserve isn't raising rates fast enough, and the Fed lost credibility with its perspective on inflation that it was transitory. Two questions. Do you think that the Federal Reserve needs to raise rates at a faster clip than they have outlined for the American public, and for that matter, for the world? And what will it take to restore that lost credibility?
Well, let me just say, it wasn't just the Federal Reserve. The administration also was talking about inflation would be under control. So, I think from the Fed standpoint, in hindsight, they clearly waited too long. But having said that, when you're managing the economy and you're the Federal Reserve, I think you have to balance both sides of that equation. I don't buy that the Fed has lost credibility. I think the fact that the Fed moved in 75 basis points, which a month ago is not what the market expected. I think Chair Powell has now signaled another 75 basis points. I think if you look at the dot plots, which I never was a big fan of these dot plots, but that's another story. I think the market understands that expectations are the Fed's going to raise rates. I think the portfolio is just as important, and they're beginning to slow that down. Look, a year ago I said we're going to have 10-year Treasuries 3 to 3.5%, and people thought that was really high. We basically have 10-year Treasuries at 3 to 3.5%. If the market really didn't have credibility in the Fed, the long end would be a lot higher than it is.
That's fair. Mr. Secretary, you've been an advocate for swift and severe sanctions in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I think most people would concur that, unfortunately, they haven't done enough to rein in the Russian war machine. 4 months into a hideous war, there's no sign that Vladimir Putin is ready to back down. What, if anything, in your opinion, would work now?
Well, let me just say, when I was an advocate of sanctions, that was actually before the war started, okay? And I think there's a chance that sanctions may or may not have been a policy tool that worked. Now that the war is going on, unfortunately, Europe is dependent for Russia on natural gas and for energy. And there's a lot of money that's going to Russia. So to a large extent, most of the sanctions that are in place, there's still a lot of money. And the reality of it is, you just can't cut that off. Now, I will tell you, the Chancellor, who was finance minister, and I had this same conversation 3 years ago, and when we sanctioned Nord Stream 2, we did it exactly for this reason, that we didn't want Europe dependent upon Russia for natural gas. We said start building terminals, whether it's natural gas from the Mideast or natural gas from the U.S. We encourage them to diversify their supply chains.
So the question, of course, then is, if we want a restoration of some semblance of peace, and with it, whatever happens in the way of a restoration of energy supplies, who knows what the future holds in store, there needs to be an off-ramp. And Henry Kissinger last month said that Ukraine should cede territory to Russia in the interest of peace. Would you agree?
What I would say is I don't think that's the conversation we should be having at this point, because I think that's a very complicated issue, and quite frankly, I think that's up to Ukraine and not for the U.S. or others to dictate. What I would encourage is we should just have an unconditional ceasefire. So I think the most important issue at the moment is getting both sides to stop fighting and stop killing people and to get them to the table. It's not for me to say what Ukraine should do, but having said that, I think it's the right thing that the U.S. has given aid, but I think we also need to encourage a political solution. And by the way, we need to have not just the U.S., we need to have Europe, we need to have China, we need to have our friends in the Mideast and around the world come together to encourage a ceasefire.
Several governments here in the Mideast, in the Gulf region, in fact, have been reluctant to condemn, or even to criticize Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. What, if anything, does that signal to you?
Well, I wouldn't say what it signals or it doesn't signal. I think the bigger issue and the problem is we have a breakdown in a rules-based system. And some people characterize this as democracies versus non-democracies. That, to me, is not the issue. The issue is we need to have, and we have had post-World War II, at least a rules-based system where people agree on rules. And I would say in the case of Ukraine, there was the Hamburg Agreement. So forget NATO. In the Hamburg Agreement, they had the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons. They gave up those nuclear weapons with a guarantee from the US, UK, and Russia. So, I do believe that this is a very significant issue.
And how would you suggest it be resolved in that respect?
Again, I think the first way we have to resolve this is to stop the fighting. I think that we can't solve, there's not a simple solution. There's not a simple off-ramp. My own opinion is I think we got here because there were miscalculations on both sides, but the world has to come together and we need a ceasefire.
President Biden is traveling to meet the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman next month. What's the best argument he can make for the Saudis and others to get on side with U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Ukraine?
Well, let me first say I am pleased to see that President Biden is traveling to the region. He's not just traveling to meet with the Saudis. There's going to be a meeting of the GCC. This is a very, very important region, and I think it's very good that he's coming to the region to meet with the leaders in the region to discuss not just Ukraine, but the stability, the long-term importance of energy in the region, and quite frankly, the issue with Iran, and making sure that we have peace amongst the neighbors. I know there's some discussions around security guarantees. Again, Qatar has been an incredible partner to the U.S., hosting bases here and others, and I think that security to the region and energy security are two important topics, as well as Ukraine, that he'll need to address.
There's a new level of hostility, as I'm certain you're aware, in some of the language that China is using toward the U.S., specifically around Taiwan. How do you interpret that hostile language?
Well, a lot of people talk about Taiwan and Ukraine and try to make the analogy. I don't think there's an analogy between the two.
Really? How come?
Taiwan is a complicated subject that multiple administrations since Henry Kissinger are around, I guess, what you'd call the one China policy and strategic ambiguity. So again, I think that's a very different situation than Ukraine. But again, I spent a lot of time going back and forth to China. I'm proud of the trade deal we did with them. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. I think the tariffs were effective in getting China to the negotiating table. We need to rebalance the trading relationship between China and the U.S. and China and other areas. And again, I think there needs to be important diplomatic discussions between the U.S. and China and on areas of mutual cooperation. And again, I believe the Chinese have to be part of the equation in telling President Putin that we need to stop these hostilities.
Are you suggesting that people should not, that in no way Ukraine is an analog for the kind of response that a Taiwanese situation may require?
Again, I think I know a lot of people are concerned and want to equate, is China going to attack Taiwan? My own opinion is I don't see that occurring in the near term. I think it's a different situation, and obviously the long-term situation in Taiwan, the independence of Taiwan, the security agreements that the U.S. have given to them are all very, very important issues, but I don't see it as the same analogy. I will say, one of the lessons for the U.S. and others we're way too dependent on Taiwan for semiconductors. I am, encouraged by the bipartisan agreement to encourage development of semiconductors in the U.S. But I think we've learned in COVID, we've learned in other situations, from an economic standpoint, we have to diversify supply chains.
Given what you mentioned just a few moments ago, that Taiwan has been, so to speak, on the table for many years because of the strategic ambiguity question, when you were in cabinet, was there a contingency plan for dealing with an invasion of Taiwan?
I obviously can't discuss anything close to that topic one way or another.
Well, that obviates my next question, which was, what did it involve?
Good idea.
Is the U.S. dollar strong enough to be weaponized in the form of sanctions against the Chinese economy?
You know, again, this is one of these fun things I'm now allowed to talk about. You know, as Treasury Secretary, I once went to Davos and I made what I thought was a very moderate comment on the dollar and both sides and very balanced. It was like sneezing and the dollar currency markets went crazy. So, you know, there kind of had been a rule till I got there. Every Treasury Secretary is supposed to say, I believe in the strong dollar. We actually believed in a stable dollar. Obviously, President Trump was very focused on trade, and trade has different issues. So I really do believe the long-term stability of the dollar is very important. Look, I think for the next 5 or 10 years, the dollar is the safe haven of the world. I always felt we had to be very careful and we had to be responsible in using sanctions, that we had a responsibility because we were the reserve currency. I don't really see a change to that in the near term. But, you know, having said that, we can't assume that forever that will be the case.
Why not?
Well, it may be, let me just clarify that. It may be that the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency for the next 100 or 1,000 years, and I don't really see anything that's going to challenge it at the moment, but I'm just saying we can't take that for granted. That has to be something that, with being a reserve currency, comes great responsibilities.
I'm curious, when we talk about Taiwan, when we talk about the dollar, when we talk about Ukraine and Russia, when we talk about the economy, these are complex matters. And of course, as the Treasury Secretary, when you were in cabinet, you had to have your own opinion, you had to solicit opinions from others. Now that you're back in private life, when you need intelligence, when you need an informed opinion on these matters, to whom do you turn?
Well, you know, when I was in the administration, I played a significant role in both dealing with the Congress and passing legislation. So I developed relationships on both sides. So I continue to have those relationships, and I'm out of politics, but behind the scenes I still speak to a lot of people on both the Republican side and the Democratic side, and try to both encourage certain things. I mean, I'll just say I think Senator Mnuchin has really done a great thing. And had the administration passed the last deal they wanted to do,
the Build Back Better bill.
The Build Back Better, if they think inflation is a problem now, you know, we really would have had inflation. Again, if I were to look back at history, the last deal I did, you know, I never thought I'd say I spent $4 trillion. Spent $4 trillion. 2.3 was the first, 700 was the second. The third was Pelosi and I were negotiating before the election. She wanted $2 trillion. After the election, President Trump agreed we'd do $1 trillion. Biden came back. He never even reduced that. So they did another $2 trillion. In hindsight, that never should have been done.
Not a single dollar of it?
I don't believe so. I believe that a big component of the reason we have the inflationary pressure is that last bill pushed us over the edge.
Of course, now, the current Treasury Secretary, the President for that matter, and people around the world are wrestling with this inflationary problem. Specifically in the United States, I'm not sure you're aware, but another former Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers, spoke yesterday about this very issue and drew a connection that it would appear the Treasury Department and the White House and maybe even the Fed are really loath to draw, which is inflation and jobs, because jobs are such a political hot potato. He said that in order, even though this is a largely supply-side driven inflationary problem, in order to contain demand and bring inflation under control, the U.S. unemployment rate would have to rise to at least 5% for 5 years, considerably higher than where it is now. He didn't go into the details of his analysis, of course, and so it's a bit unfair for me to ask this question of you because you and he haven't had a conversation, but I'm sure you understand the rough mechanics of his thinking. Is that sound analysis?
Well, let me first say, I think Larry Summers was, one of the only people on the Democratic side who called this right early on, and I give him a lot of credit for that. As other people like myself who were saying these things, he came out as well. I haven't seen his analysis, so I'm not sure I'd say I agree with that. What I would say is, the models, because we had so much fiscal response and so much monetary response after COVID, the models didn't work. And the reason why a lot of people didn't predict inflation was because the models didn't work. Those same traditional models, I'm not sure will work on the way up. But again, I go back to, if I were to look at the economy, now to me, the biggest predictor of the global economy is going to be, can we settle down energy markets? There's a big difference between $175 oil and $75 oil. So, we're adjusting to higher energy prices. People in the U.S. are particularly sensitive, obviously, to gasoline at the pump and very high levels. Again, if we can stabilize the energy market, I believe when the Fed does their job, we'll have inflation under control. If we don't, we have a big problem.
Since leaving the Treasury Department, you've gone back to being an investor. You raised, if I'm not mistaken, $2.5 billion for your firm, Liberty Strategic Capital, and you have already taken at least 5 stakes in companies focused on cybersecurity and satellite technology. What would you describe as the strategy behind those investments? The term that comes to mind to me is warfare of the future. Is that a fair description?
Well, I'd say, really the idea behind our business is to focus on our experience in the government and our private investment experience. And the 2 areas we're most focused on are technology and fintech and financials. I would say in technology, cyber is the #1 concern. It is, as you said, it's the warfare of the future. As I tell CEOs, if you're not worried about cyber, there's something wrong. If you listen to your chief technology officer tell you, oh, I have it under control, you better ask a lot more questions. The good news is there's a lot of great products that companies and governments and individuals can use to protect themselves. So we are very focused on national security issues in the business.
As you're well aware, Mr. Secretary, there are some people who take issue with you having raised money from the same sovereign states with whom you negotiated with as Treasury Secretary on behalf of the administration. How do you respond to those criticisms?
Well, I'm not really going to comment on that directly. What I will say is, I'm proud of the work we did in the region. I think we did very, very important work across many, many policies, and that really has nothing to do with the business that we're now doing.
The private investment firm that
Correct.
You're running. I've been dying to ask you about crypto, and a smile creeps across his face because he likes talking about it too. You flagged months ago the risk in call it a branch, department of crypto known as stablecoins, and you warned that they were little better than casino chips. Casino chips was the term that you used. What, Mr. Secretary, is the lesson today to the investors who lost billions on Terra and Luna, billions more now on these DeFi projects that are unraveling, and the broader meltdown in crypto that brought Bitcoin to under $18,000 just a couple of days ago?
Well, let me just say, I'm proud of a lot of the work we did at the Treasury. This was one area we ran out of time, and particularly because of COVID, we weren't able to complete the work. We actually had put out a paper, an interagency paper, on stablecoins. And in simplicity, if you're going to advertise a stablecoin, it should be backed by currency. So if it's a stablecoin dollar, there should be dollars in a custodian that you can change them. If it's euros, the same thing. The fact that people could advertise a stablecoin that had nothing behind it other than an arbitrage mechanism, I mean,
an algorithm, effectively.
An algorithm, if there's ever an area for regulation, That's pretty obvious or should be. I mean, it's like if I buy a government money market fund, it's got to be U.S. governments. It can't be I'm buying high yield. The other area we focused on a lot was really transparency. Again, if people want to buy these things, they should be fully transparent and subject to the same BSA and money laundering. And, you know, I've always said, I personally don't think it's a hedge on inflation, but if people wanted to buy it, as long as there's proper regulation, that's fine. I think a lot of people got caught up in the hype that this stuff would just go up forever. Now
that it's come back down, is there a lesson they should take?
Well, again, I think, I heard this comment earlier today in one of the sessions, and I agree completely. People consider crypto and Bitcoin and blockchain the same. The underlying blockchain technologies are really, really interesting, and I think have a lot of valid use cases and have a lot of potential. Again, as it relates to crypto, and that was Mansour who made the comment, so I'll give him credit on that. As it relates to crypto, and again, I just think there needs to be the appropriate regulation, not over-regulation, but appropriate regulation.
You seem very happy, Mr. Secretary, to be back in private life. If President Trump ran again in 2024, and he won, and he asked you to serve in his cabinet again, would you?
Well, look, I'm enjoying my private life, and I've put politics behind me. If President Trump calls me at the time, obviously I'll take his call, and we'll deal with that at the time. But I'm enjoying private life, and I'm not intending to go back into politics at the moment.
And we'll finish with this: should he run again?
I'll answer a slightly different question, which is, I think if the election were in 6 months, I think he will run again. What happens in 2 years, we'll see.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your time here at the Qatar Economic Forum.
Thank you.